Welcome back to Passions Over Pancakes. My name is Hannah. I am the host and the creator of this project, a project in which I interview people about their passions while we eat pancakes. Today is the second part of Kennan's episode on home birth, why we need to get out of the hospitals for giving birth, why women are completely capable of giving birth without medication, and why we don't necessarily need hospitals unless you're a high-risk pregnancy. I just finished editing this episode, and I can tell you for a fact that you are going to want to open up your notebooks, get out a piece of paper, write some things down, and I promise you are going to be so inspired after hearing her story and after hearing everything that she has to say. I can guarantee it, man. I am so inspired right now. Gosh, you're just gonna love it. I also wanted to let you know that this episode is a little bit different. I'm not currently with my normal editing software and I'm not near my microphone. The introduction here as well as the advertisement is going to be recorded on my phone, and you can't always rely on Zoom audio, so some of the things are a little bit funky during the episode. Please don't mind that. Thank you for sticking with me as we're working out all the kinks, and I just appreciate you being here. I really do. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right back into Kennan's episode. If you have not seen the previous episode, the first part of this conversation, please go watch that because there's going to be quite a few callbacks to last episode, and that's kind of a good base starting point for this episode. So if you haven't listened to that, pause it right here, go back and listen to the previous episode, and without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into the second part of this conversation with Kennan. Welcome back, everybody. Thank you again to Kennan for being here, and welcome to part 2 of this conversation with Kennan. I like that, conversation with Kennan. We're going to be talking today in this episode about midwives, doulas, the history behind how we're kind of getting back into midwifery, and most of all, which is the thing that I'm probably most excited for, is Kennan's birth story. Unmedicated, crunchy mom type of thing. Very excited about it. So welcome back to Passions Over Pancakes, and let's get right back into this. So, Kennan, welcome back.
Thank you. I think I'm more excited for this one than I was the last one. I definitely have a soapbox to stand on for my less than love for hospitals and maternity wards, but I definitely have, I think, a bigger soapbox when it comes to just like natural childbirth and how amazing the woman's body is and how amazing childbirth is, and we should all get back to it. Everyone should have an unmedicated birth. That's my stance.
I'm super excited about this too. I'm also going to be honest and say that I think I'm more excited for this episode. I was super excited for the last episode for the history of things. And
it's necessary to talk about that before you talk about this. So I get it.
It was just the precursor. It was the thing to get you excited, to learn about everything before.
Whet the palate, whet the appetite.
Exactly. So I'm super excited about this. So let's jump just right into it, shall we?
Let's do it.
If you have not listened to the previous episode, like Kennan said, it is pretty important to go ahead and listen to that first, just so that you kind of have a background of what's going on, a background of hospitals, a background of midwifery, and all of that, just as Kennan said, just to whet your palate, just so that you have a little bit of a clue of what's going on in this episode, because we are going to be calling back to a lot of the information that was said in this episode as well. So with that being said, since we are talking about midwives and doulas in this episode, would you be willing to go ahead and give just a quick rundown of what the difference is between a midwife and a doula, what they do, and how they impact each other and the mom?
Yeah, for sure. I want to preface this by saying that I'm not a medical professional by any means. I don't have a scope to practice medicine at all, nor am I a professional on just in general for any of this. So I am a trained doula though, so I do have a little bit of background and knowledge on this. So there are a couple of different types of midwives. There's certified nurse midwives, and certified professional midwives, as well as direct entry midwives. So there's a couple of differences between them. I would just recommend looking up the different types of midwives. The one thing that I will say is midwives are medical professionals. It takes about 8 to 10 years to become a midwife. There's lots of nursing that goes into it and medical training as well. They are able to birth your baby. That's the biggest misconception. I think people hear midwife and they think of like some crunchy gal with braids and a they think of like Ina May Gaskins, right? You should look up Ina May Gaskins, like out in a barn, no medical training, a horse is going to be there, like stable delivery like Mary with Jesus. It's not what it is. They're medical professionals, and they are very skilled at what they do, and qualified to do what they do. And then doulas have no medical scope whatsoever. Very simply put, a doula is a labor support person. So a doula is someone who learns what you want from your birth, kind of your birth plan, things that are important to you, and is able to advocate for you when you no longer can. Labor and delivery is a very vulnerable time, an impressionable time, and you can't really advocate for yourself like you think that you would be able to, outside of childbirth. And so a doula is someone who can be there to advocate for your wants, your needs, and your desires surrounding your birth. You can have a doula for a scheduled C-section, for an induced labor, and a natural, the ideal crunchy birth, like up in the mountains in a tub, right? So a doula can be there for whatever type of birth you have.
Thank you so much for explaining the difference between these two.
Yeah.
For those listening who may not have known the difference, I did not know the difference until about 15 minutes ago when I asked Kennan. So I'm not going to pretend that I knew any of that. I'm really grateful that you put that so well, just the difference between the two, because I learned a lot from that, and I'm sure everybody else did too. So with kind of the differences between midwives and doulas and what they do, how are they best supporting the mom in her childbirth? Doulas, of course, advocating for the mom, and midwives doing a lot too. How are they working together to provide the best experience for the mom?
Well, a midwife is trained in physiological birth. So this is kind of something that we talked about the last episode, that obstetricians are trained surgeons, and they don't specialize in physiological birth. Midwives do. They understand what happens during natural childbirth, and they are able to facilitate a woman birthing in an unintervention-riddled way. And you do have to be a good candidate to be attended by a midwife. It's not like a midwife is just any and every birth. There are midwives like that, but there are some cases in high-risk pregnancies that you do need to be in a hospital, and you do need to be attended by an obstetrician. Multiples, in triplets or more, almost always have to be attended by an obstetrician. There are lots of birth centers that midwives deliver twins, so that's kind of a thing of the past, that you have to have a C-section or be in a hospital if you're having twins. You don't. Even things like breech deliveries, midwives are fantastic with breech deliveries, if they have to feel comfortable with it, but traditionally midwives will birth any type of way. They believe at its core that birth is a natural event that sometimes needs medical intervention instead of being a medical event like we talked about last episode. And the doula comes alongside the woman and does kind of the emotional side of it. So the midwife does the medical side of it, monitoring the baby, making sure that things are progressing the way that they should, transferring to a hospital when they need to, and not transferring too late. That's a big part of birth center care and even home birth care, is the midwife knows when things are going wrong and when transfer needs to happen, and it happens earlier rather than later like you would think. And then, like I said, the doula is for emotional support and saying, I'm gonna hold this woman's hips if that's what she needs at this moment. I am going to look this woman in the face and tell her that she's strong and capable if that's what she needs at that moment. I'm going to stand in the corner with my hands behind my back if that's what that woman needs at that moment.
I love that it seems, and we kind of touched on this a little bit in the last episode as well, where surgeons and OBs and hospitals do advocate to their patients to a certain extent, but maybe not in the way that they should be advocated for. And it seems, with the information that I'm hearing, it seems like midwives and doulas are really trying to advocate for the mom and the baby and the family in general in the way that the mother wishes to be advocated for. That's so awesome and so needed. So needed. Oh my gosh. Okay, so with that, again, this is something that we talked about a little bit in the last episode with just the history behind hospitals and history behind OBGYN. Let's dive into a little bit of the history and how things seemed to have turned a little bit back towards midwifery. What's the story behind that?
Yeah. So before the 1900s, like 98% of all births occurred at home. Not even in birth centers, at home. And you would call them, or not call, but you'd call for the midwife, and she would come any hour. And your doula was a lot of times just a woman in your community that had children and had attended births. It was a community event in very small communities. That's just how it was. You're having a baby. Oh, I've got 10 of those. You know, I know how to do it. I'll come help you. That kind of thing. And so once the hospitals kind of got introduced, it kind of flipped to 90% of babies were born in the hospital instead of at home. And then in the 70s, right after the twilight sleep era, which we talked about, you definitely need to go listen to that last episode to learn about twilight sleep. But after scopolamine, women wanted out of the hospital to get away from twilight sleep. And the way to do that was to return to midwifery and home birth. You couldn't get away from scopolamine in the hospital. So what do? You get out of the hospital. And in the 70s, what do you have? You have hippies, you have Woodstock, you have all of these like crunchy granola things coming up, right? You have communes, which mirrored what communities used to look like, you know?
Yeah,
and so
absolutely.
You have midwives on the commune that take care of all of the pregnant women, and that's just how you do it. And they were seeing better results. They were losing less moms and losing less babies than the hospitals. And so it's just been a slow and steady progression. One thing that I'm actually very thankful for COVID for, silver lining to COVID, is it drove moms back into home and birth centers to give birth, because hospital regulations were whackety doodle do during COVID.
Absolutely.
Partners were not allowed to be in the room with moms giving birth. You couldn't have a doula. You had to wear a mask during labor. If you've never been in labor, try running a marathon with a mask on. No, thank you. And so what happened is women were like, nope, I'm not giving birth in the hospital. I'll just give birth right here at home or in birth centers that had fewer regulations as far as that goes. So, yeah, it's been an interesting swing, but the United States is the only developed country that still does like 95% of its births at the hospital. Every other developed country has like 60% of their births in birth centers or at home or more.
That's so interesting. Just to think that, I mean, especially with COVID in 2020 driving moms back into their homes and into birth centers, I think you're right, such a silver lining in all of this. I remember hearing about people who at the very beginning of COVID and all throughout 2020, before most hospitals kind of let up on their regulations of having to do their birth alone in a room with pretty much complete strangers. Of course, their OB that they had, been with for however long, but sometimes not even that OB was able to be there. And not having your husband be able to be there with you is just heartbreaking to me, because it's such an emotional and powerful event that is so important to experience together. And for the husband or partner to not be there it's just a wild regulation that had to happen. And I mean, not even to mention, of course, what you had said with having to wear a mask during your labor. That's just wild to me. And yeah, in a way, thank God for COVID, because it's really, of course, in a way, making light of that, which, of course, maybe shouldn't be making light of it, but in the sense of midwifery.
Yeah.
How cool.
A really great documentary to watch if you want to learn more about kind of that switch back over to midwifery is Ina May Gaskin, her documentary called Birth Story. Ina May Gaskin and the Farm Midwives. The farm still exists. It's a commune, and there's a midwifery practice on it, and it's fantastic. Ina May Gaskins has attended over 1,200 births. And I think she's said before that her first C-section wasn't needed until birth 184 or something like that.
Wow.
And then her second C-section was like 350 something.
Oh my goodness.
If you just need a little bit of evidence that midwifery is working better than the hospital system, look to Ida Mae Gaskin. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my goodness. So one thing that you had said in the previous interview, kind of a quote from the father of obstetrics, was essentially that women aren't strong enough for pregnancy and for giving birth, which again is wild that somebody who has made his career in this is saying something to that effect. And of course, we could get into a lot of little things about that type of quote, but in short, tell me from your experience and from people that you've seen, why are women strong enough to give birth, and why is that so wildly outrageous that is even a thought in some people's heads that women might not be strong enough for birth?
Yeah. Well, I'll start with God made women's bodies to give birth. So he did that perfectly. Childbirth was meant to happen even before the fall. We were meant to be fruitful and multiply before the fall even happened. So there's a lot of, the fall and the curse of intensified labors. That's a whole other thing that we could get into. But what I'll mainly say is that childbirth was always meant to happen. Always. And so there's no need to be afraid of it. Your body was perfectly designed, and we'll get into it a little bit later. There's so many things that I'm just in awe of the human body when it comes to childbirth. It's just incredible what the body does, how the body prepares, and things like that.
So God made our bodies perfectly, and women have been doing it for thousands of years. Thousands of years. I don't understand why some guy in the 1900s gets to come along and say, oh, these poor women, they shouldn't be subjected to something as horrendous as childbirth. One thing that kind of led into, women being pushed into the hospitals is the way that savages birthed. And the father of modern obstetrics has also said this, that you don't want to look like the savages when they give birth. They squat down and look like they're defecating. That's so nasty and gross and messy. You don't want to be like that. Come into the hospital, and we'll get into why laying on your back and having your knees spread apart is horrible for the physiological aspect of birth, and why squatting is much better. But yeah, it was men that came in and said, oh, you poor little woman, you can't handle that. And like I said in the last video, the last episode, again, I'm not a feminist. I'll get on that soapbox later, but women are absolutely strong enough and capable enough to give birth. And in fact, it's the most empowering, most incredible experience that a woman will ever have. It's what leads you into motherhood.
I'm not like a super charismatic person at all, but I think birth is spiritual. I think it's a rite of passage of sorts, and I don't think there's anything else like it. It's just incredible.
Absolutely. Watching people go through the process of from beginning to end, finding out that they're pregnant, and I mean, even before that, trying to get pregnant, finding out they're pregnant, going through their pregnancy, becoming already becoming a mom when you're pregnant, but then having this baby in your arms after giving birth, and then watching them progress their family is just so cool to watch. And I love finding out that my friends are pregnant. I love finding out that strangers are pregnant, because it's just so cool to watch the dynamic change from wanting to be a mom, or some people might not even want to be a mom, but they just grow into that role so effortlessly, and sometimes with hard work too. Of course, it's hard work being a mom and figuring out all that you need to do to be a mom and keep this little human alive. It's just so cool to watch, and to be able to watch them become more empowered throughout their pregnancy is something, from an outside perspective, is just so incredible to watch people grow into the role of, I can do this and I will do this. So yeah, just hearing that somebody who is, again, making his career out of women being pregnant has the audacity really to say something like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So with that, I know that you wanted to talk about some things within pregnancy, specifically, pelvic dynamics, failure to progress, kind of those types of things. Tell me more about that type of stuff. Let's start with really anything you want to talk about between pelvic dynamics, failure to progress, all that stuff. Tell me more about it.
So this will be like a little mini childbirth class for people. What is so cool is that the vast majority of women are low risk and able to give birth naturally, vaginally, and unmedicated if they want to. The pelvis is such a cool bone, and it's actually not rigid like people think. It moves. It's very flexible. There are tendons that connect it. It's in several different pieces, actually. And in pregnancy, there's a hormone called relaxin that increases up, and it's the highest that it will be during labor. And what it does is it relaxes these tendons in your muscles. So you go from, for people just listening, it might not be...
Watch the YouTube video.
Yeah, watch the YouTube video because you're going to lose a little bit of this. But, so my thumbs are going to be the top of the pelvis, right? And my pinkies are going to be the bottom. So your pelvis is like this naturally, and it's outside of pregnancy, and for men, it's almost always very rigid. During pregnancy and leading up to labor, the hormone relaxin starts allowing the pelvis to move. And this is what we call pelvic dynamics. So you have the top of your pelvis that baby goes into, and that is the inlet. And then you have the bottom of your pelvis where baby comes out, and that is the outlet. It's really easy to remember, in and then out. And then you have the midline of your pelvis, which is the inside. So if you were to externally rotate your knees, you actually close the outlet of your pelvis. So Hannah, you can do it. And you can feel that if you turn your knees out, you close the bottom of your pelvis. Mm-hmm. Again, if you lay on your back, you close your sacrum. So laying on your back with your knees spread closes the bottom outlet of your pelvis, literally as closed as it can possibly be. Well, who makes you lay on your back with your knees spread? I'll let you answer that question. I won't implicate anybody. But a much better way to birth a baby is to internally rotate your knees, which opens the outlet of your pelvis and closes the inlet. So it moves like this. To open your sacrum, you tilt your butt back, and that opens your sacrum. So if you are squatted on your knees with your knees together, tilting your butt back like you're picking your butt up, the pelvis is the most open that it could possibly be. I don't know about you, but it seems a lot more plausible to me that it'd be easier to push a baby out when your pelvis is open like that. I don't know, that's just me. Whatever. But that goes along with failure to progress as well, because a lot of times in the hospital, you're laying on your back with an epidural, you haven't been moving, your knees are open, and they're telling you to push. Well, baby gets stuck, and they actually do get stuck because your pelvis is closed, and that's more along the failure to progress side of things, that if you're not moving, you're not progressing. That's just the bottom line of it. And then once you start pushing, doctors are very adamant that baby comes out within a certain amount of time. You've got fetal monitors going on that are showing dips and increases in heart rate. Well, that happens naturally during childbirth. There's an acceptable range as to what that can be, and it does change. So baby's not coming. You're pushing, baby's at the top of the birth canal, baby's not coming, and you'll move to an emergency C-section if baby doesn't come soon enough. Well, in all actuality, if you move that mom around a little bit, get her onto her knees, maybe over the bed, have her lift her butt up, baby would come pretty easily. There's nothing wrong with the American woman's pelvis, and women's bodies grow a baby that they can birth. That's just physiologically true. Your body is not going to grow something that it can't birth. And so a lot of times I'll hear moms say, yeah, I had to have an emergency C-section. My pelvis was too small. Well, there's a lot that goes into that. And if you're a woman who had a C-section because a doctor told you that your pelvis was too small, I just want to say that I'm sorry that a doctor told you that, but your body is perfect the way that it was made. And it's hard because no one wants to feel like something that they had no choice over happened to them, because that's the root of trauma, right? And so there might be some trauma that people need to work through, especially if they're listening to this and hearing this. A lot of the response that I get is people get mad when I say, no, your pelvis isn't too small. I'm very careful about what I say to who I say it, because that can be really offensive when someone's going through that and they have to come to terms with the idea that maybe what happened to them wasn't necessary. That's really hard, and I want to give that the proper attention that it needs. But I'll say very rarely, because I don't want to lay a blanket over it, very rarely is your pelvis too small. They just had you in a position that was not physiologically appropriate for what you were doing. I gave birth to Knox on my knees, squatting with my butt back. And there are lots of different positions that work. But the point is, if baby's not coming, move around. The pelvis shifts and changes in such amazing ways. You can get that baby unstuck. Another thing with shoulder dystocia, Ina May Gaskins has a maneuver called the Gaskin maneuver, where if the head is birthed and the shoulders get stuck, many times, you can, if a woman is laying on her back and the baby gets stuck, you flip her onto her knees, and almost every time the baby will just immediately be born, because it shifts the pelvis around to where the baby can get unstuck. But what happens in the hospital, if you have shoulder dystocia, episiotomies can happen, forceps deliveries, vacuum assisted deliveries, lots of really not great things can happen. So shoulder dystocia is a real thing, and it can harm a baby. Very rarely is it accurately diagnosed. That's what I'll say.
Another thing I know you wanted to talk about in conjunction with all of this is the sphincter law. And
Yeah.
I'm interested to know what that is, but also how this impacts birth in general.
Yeah.
And what is it first off, and then tell us just everything that we need to know about it.
So this kind of been coined by Ina May Gaskin, who is like the most famous midwife ever. The cervix isn't technically a sphincter, I don't think. I could get that wrong, don't quote me on that. But it certainly functions like a sphincter. So think of your anal sphincter. Imagine that you're taking a poo in the bathroom and someone walks in on you. What happens?
You clench up.
Yep. And the rest of the poo doesn't go very good. The same thing happens with the cervix. When you are in pain, and you're afraid of that pain, and you are tense, that sphincter is not going to open or relax. If you have a bunch of strangers running around you that you're not comfortable around, it is not going to relax. If you have a doctor making you uncomfortable doing mandatory cervical checks, you're not going to be opened and relaxed. You are going to be closed and tight, and of course you're not going to progress. If you're fearful of something, it's going to be painful. Whether it is or not, that pain is going to be magnified. If you're in pain, you're going to be tense. If you're tense, you're more likely to be more afraid of the pain that's coming, which is going to make you more tense. So it's this really vicious cycle. If you're not in a comfortable place, if you're in a hospital that smells bad, strangers are walking in and out, the lights are really bright. I don't know anybody who prefers pooping at like a Walmart with strangers walking in and out and the lights are really bright rather than like their own home. The same thing applies. So that's sphincter law. And then you can get into breech deliveries and stuff like that as far as, the dangers of that and the importance of keeping the cervix really soft and open and keeping the mom calm. But that's for another day.
Maybe we'll have you back on again and we'll talk more about, gosh, there's so many things I want to pick your brain about.
I know.
Oh my gosh. Oh man. Okay. Maybe one day we'll have you back on and we'll talk more about this, of course. But I'd love to, maybe this is a sneak peek into the future for our listeners, but I'd love to talk to you about birth control at some point on the podcast. That's something that I'm starting to get passionate about. A lot of things I would love to talk to you about, just especially pertaining to this. But okay, so with all of this information that I'm learning a ton about, and I'm sure everybody is as well, it's interesting learning about this side of things because as a generic American woman, what I know about birth isn't very much, especially going through watching in movies and TV shows, the part of birth that Hollywood wants you to see and the dramatic part of birth that may or may not be real. And the more I'm looking into it, the more it's, very dramatized. And also the education of public schools and private schools of what birth is so little. And I think kind of the extent of my knowledge going through school was I watched a documentary of somebody giving birth and it was so dramatized. And that's how I've thought of birth. And I don't know if it's just my YouTube algorithm or everybody's YouTube algorithm, but I've been getting a lot of kind of more crunchy mom type of things for people who are interested in this type of thing. I'm sure Kennan can recommend so many people, but two people that I would highly recommend is Sarah's Day on YouTube, as well as Sarah Therese. I have eaten up her videos so much, especially about just how she parents. She has some really great videos on her actual birth experience. And that has been so wild and so crazy. I've sent, I don't know if I've sent a couple or just one video to Kennan just saying like, this is so crazy. This is wild. And it's amazing what the woman's body can do and is doing and is created for. So the jump from seeing what I saw in the awful sex ed class that I had to becoming more educated in the birth and pregnancy experience, it's such a dramatic shift between what we think birth is in the hospitals and screaming and blood and crying and being rushed to the hospital and what can be a very peaceful, in a way. I don't know if holy is the right word to use here, but it just feels like
that doesn't offend me, but I think holy is a decent word for that. Yeah.
A very serene and spiritual, like you said, and holy experience, seeing what it can be from other people's experiences. So it's just a crazy shift. And to think about pregnancy in and of itself, if I think about pregnancy for too long, my brain short circuits because you're growing a human inside of you and our bodies were so perfectly created for that. And it's so wild to me in the coolest way that people are pregnant, women are pregnant, and they're just walking around with humans inside of them.
Yeah.
So crazy to me. So crazy. But yeah, so I think that's probably, I'm not going to speak for everybody, but that might be the generic extent of people's knowledge about birth and seeing things in Hollywood and movies and TV shows of people screaming, crying, blood, everybody's freaking out. The mom might make it, the baby might not make it. And while those things do, like those are real fears of people.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. But if that's all we see, then that's going to be our experience. And that's going to be a real fear put into people's minds. So with all of that being said, in your experience and in your opinion, how can somebody have a positive birth experience?
Yeah. I think I hear a lot of times in the birth world people saying healthy mom, healthy baby. If you have a healthy mom and a healthy baby, then that was a positive experience. But that's not the case. You can have really severe trauma that happens and end up with a healthy mom and a healthy baby. So A positive birth experience isn't just a crunchy granola mountainside birth in a tub with like essential oils. That's not what a positive birth experience is. A positive birth experience is one where a woman feels heard, understood. She feels like she consented to all of the things that happened to her body. She felt supported. She felt like she was participating in an experience rather than having something happen to her. That's a recipe for trauma, right? That you are not in control of something and that something is happening to you that you don't want to happen. That's trauma. And it can really easily happen in childbirth because it's something that definitely in a sense happens to you. You don't have control over it, and if you're not prepared and if you're not ready to experience that, it can do some like mental tricks on you that aren't good. Or if you are prepared for it and you can participate in it and you know the things that are happening to your body, knowledge is power, it can be a transformative, it will be transformative, but it can be an empowering and amazing experience. You can have a positive birth experience with an emergency C-section, baby in the NICU, all of these like horrible things that are like worst case scenario, right? You can still have a positive experience because all of the things that I mentioned, you were listened to, you felt like you consented to what happened. Even in the case of an emergency C-section, the doctor doesn't come in and say, we have to do this now, you have no choice, or it's not presented that way. It's, okay, here are options. This is about how much time we have to make this decision. We've got about 10 minutes, or we've got about 5 minutes to make this decision. We've got 3 minutes to make this decision. Here are our options. It's not, this is happening to you right now. You can have a really horrible birth experience up in the mountains in the tub where no one listens to you and you felt like things went wrong and you weren't consenting to the things that happened to you. Midwives can cause negative birth experiences. Midwives can cause birth trauma. It's not just like this and that, it's not black and white. A woman has to be taken care of and supported in this thing that she is experiencing, that she's participating in. So that's my hot take on it.
I love that. And I appreciate too the flip side of you can have a negative experience in both scenarios, whether it's in the hospital or whether it's in the mountains. It's possible to have a negative experiences in both terms. And I think that's important to say too. Yeah. And it feels like everything, and because it feels like everything is so subjective in terms of a positive pregnancy. So what could be a positive pregnancy to somebody in a hospital may be an awful pregnancy to a different person in the same scenario, and vice versa. The most positive experience with somebody who gives birth in a midwifery birth center, that could be their dream birthing experience, but absolute hell for somebody else. So everything is absolutely so subjective, and really taking into account what your values are, who you are as a person, and the research that you've done into pregnancy and birth is so vital. Yeah. This break in the program is dedicated to you standing up, taking a big old stretch, heat up your coffee, heat up your pancakes if they got cold, and I want to talk to you in the meantime about something very, very special to this conversation and to Kennan. If you listened to last week's episode, you would have known that Kennan is creating a children's book, and it is absolutely incredible. It looks amazing, the content is fantastic, and it is just so cool that she was willing and able and gung-ho enough to go ahead and just create her own book when she didn't find one that suited the needs of her and her family. You can read all about the book on her Kickstarter website, which will be linked down below. As of this moment, she's over 70% funded and there's still 2 weeks to go. There's also a huge giveaway going on with this, so please check out my Instagram at Passions Over Pancakes and Kennan's Instagram at the Canady Woman to go ahead and check out details on this giveaway. It is so stinking easy. It'll take less than a minute and it is so worth it. So please help Kennan's dreams come true. Go ahead and click the Kickstarter down below and just go ahead and check it out. You know, it doesn't hurt to give the page a view and just see what is going on with this project. Maybe share it with a friend. And I know that she will be so appreciative. With all that being said, let's get right back into this conversation with Kennan. So, Kennan, what I'm most excited for in this episode, let's take a deep dive into your pregnancy and your birth story. Let's start off with, if you're willing, tell us the story of how you found out you were pregnant, and then maybe give a call back to the last episode when you were describing when you really knew that you wanted to do kind of the crunchy mom aspect of motherhood.
Yeah, for sure. So I think I knew that I was pregnant like the day after I conceived, like in the back of my head, because I kept looking up, you know, when can you take a pregnancy test, and it was you need to wait until like 2 days before your period, and I was like, well, is there a pregnancy test that'll tell me sooner? And so I ended up taking a pregnancy test the first day that this certain pregnancy test would tell you, and it was 4 days before your missed period. I got a really faint line, like super faint, like you couldn't see it in a picture, you could just see it in person. Mm-hmm. And so I told my husband that day, and we were really excited from the get-go. I went to an OB at 8 weeks, which is the earliest they'll see you, usually 6 to 8 weeks, to confirm the pregnancy, make sure your baby's in the right spot, do your initial labs and stuff like that. And I waited in the waiting room for like 45 minutes and then was seen for like 10 minutes by the OB, who was really rushed and didn't really care. He didn't ask how I was feeling about anything. It was very like, check a box and you're done. And then I went back at, I think, 14 weeks. And the obstetrician offered an extra, this is just like a little tidbit, he offered an extra test that would tell me some fetal anomalies in case I wanted to abort the pregnancy.
Really?
So he immediately offered me abortion, essentially.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was like, well, we want our baby regardless of any health anomalies, so I don't think we need that test. And he was like, okay. So, but it was very cold. It was very sterile. Like, it just felt sterile. Like, obviously the office was sterile, but sterile in like a not friendly type of way. It was not fun to go to the OB. And right after that second appointment is when I looked up birth centers in the area. And at the time we were living in Utah. And Wasatch Midwifery, if you're in the Utah area, Wasatch Midwifery is the most fantastic practice ever. Adrienne and Jane are phenomenal midwives, and I always felt so taken care of by them. My first call to the birth center, I knew that was where I wanted to be. Cute little Claire answered, and she was like, hello, what can I do for you? And I told her that I was at an OB and that I was considering a birth center, and she stayed on the phone with me for like 45 minutes. Just talking about like, oh yeah, this is what we do. This is what we care about. We care about women. This is what our practice is about. And it was just a really great conversation. It was still in the midst of COVID stuff, so I did a virtual tour on FaceTime. My husband had some questions. He didn't not like the idea of it. He just had questions to ask. Transfer rates. What happens if something goes wrong? Do you transfer to a hospital? What's worst case scenario? And that was just him taking care of me. And I wanted to know those things too. And I encourage you to reach out to birth centers in your area to ask important questions like that. There are bad birth centers. There can be bad birth centers, but mine was fantastic. So my pregnancy was filled with love and excitement and information from the midwife on nutritional health, things that I didn't know beforehand, even all of the crunchy research that I had done, things like you need to pair your protein or you need to pair your carbs with protein so that your blood sugar doesn't spike. If you're just eating carbs, your blood sugar is going to spike and you're more at risk to develop gestational diabetes. So pairing it with a protein keeps your blood sugar from spiking. You need to be drinking like 100 to 150 ounces of water a day, which is insane. This is 40 ounces, and this is huge. So 150 ounces of water a day, and that's to keep the amniotic fluid healthy. And that actually prevents breach in a way. If you have enough amniotic fluid, baby has enough room to get flipped to head down. So keeping the amniotic fluid healthy is really important. And my OB didn't tell me any of that. My OB didn't tell me anything about nutrition, anything about water intake, nothing. So anyways, leading up to my birth, I just knew that I was going to go early, that he was going to be born early. And I think a lot of first-time moms just know that they're going to go early. That was not the case. I gave birth on 40+4. I did not come early. But I was really anxious to give birth, as I'm sure moms out there know exactly what I'm talking about. You just get so ready to meet this human that you've already known for 9-10 months. 40 weeks is 10 months, by the way.
Yeah,
Don't get me started on that. I was pregnant for 10 months, not 9.
Yeah.
But I was just ready to meet my baby. And so I did all of like the natural things to start childbirth, all of the wives' tales. I did them all except for castor oil. There's nothing wrong with that. I just didn't do it. So I had a check 40+3. So that's 40 weeks and 3 days. So my due date was 40 weeks, right? So 40 weeks, 3 days, I went in for a check. We did a non-stress test, which measures baby's heart rate, make sure everything's good. If you're having any contractions, it measures contractions. They want to see good accelerations that show that baby is going to handle labor well. This non-stress test is a lot of times if there's anything wrong and the midwife suspects that the baby will not handle labor very well, they'll transfer at that point. They'll say, I don't feel comfortable with you delivering here. I think you'd be better attended by an OB in a hospital. And they'll still accompany you and take care and make sure that you're being taken care of. But a lot of people don't know that that's how early transfers can happen, if not earlier in the pregnancy when an issue arises. So the non-stress test was good. She did do a cervical check. I did have a cervical check the week before, and I was just in like an emotional pit. I was like, I'm never gonna give birth. I'm gonna be pregnant forever. And I don't think there's any way for someone who hasn't been like 39 weeks pregnant, you can actually understand that. It's like it doesn't seem rational to me now that I'm not pregnant anymore, but I was so sad. I was like, this is never gonna happen for me. What I can say to moms who are in that season, that short little time right before you give birth, is you will have your baby soon. It will happen, I promise. Just hang on. You can be sad that you haven't given birth yet, but I promise it'll happen. So when I had my first cervical check, I was 1 centimeter dilated and 70% effaced, which 1 centimeter is like less than your finger. You dilate to 10, so not very far. But effacement is how thin the cervix gets. So I was 70% effaced, which was really pretty effaced. The cervix has to get all the way effaced before it can really fully dilate. So 100% effacement and 10 centimeters dilated is your cervix is basically gone. So that was encouraging to me. And then the next time I went, I was 40+3, and she did a cervical check, and I was 2 centimeters dilated and 80% effaced. So not much had changed, but it was progress. So I was proud of myself. It was kind of this like bolstering that I needed. Like, my body is doing it. I had been having Braxton Hicks for like 2 weeks, which are false labor contractions. And every time they would start, I would get kind of excited, and then they would just dwindle off, and then my hopes would be crushed. But after this cervical check at 40+3, I started having some cramping that felt different than any of the other Braxton Hicks that I had felt. So I don't even know how to explain how they were different. They just were. So it's kind of like period cramps, a little bit wider though than period cramps, if that makes sense, and a little bit stronger. So I went home. We got home about 3 or 4 o'clock. I called my mom. I watched some Netflix, and then I started getting these cramps in a rhythmic fashion. So I'd get one, it'd last like 20 seconds, and then 10 minutes later I'd get another one, and then 10 minutes later another one, and then 9 minutes later, and then another one. So I felt like they would come on, and then they would stop, and then they would come on, and then they would stop. So I texted my midwife, and I was like, hey, something just feels different. Something's going on. She was like, okay, thanks for letting me know. Well, at 9 o'clock, I went to the bathroom, and on the tissue was bloody show, which is, I forgot to mention, I lost my mucus plug the day before your wedding.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
So Hannah decided to get married on my due date, just for everybody.
She had the date first.
I had dibs on that, and she decided to get married on my due date. The day before I lost my mucus plug, and then I just forgot to mention that. So I go to the bathroom, I have bloody show, which is a little bit more mucus and that has blood in it. So basically what that means is your body's moving along. Like things are opening up down there and, things are moving. So texted my midwife, told her that I had bloody show. And at this point I could tell that they were contractions. They weren't really just cramps anymore, they were contractions. And so I had Elisha pull out the app that we had to time the contractions, and they were not super regular, not super long, and still a little bit far apart. And early labor can look really different for a lot of different women. So they could be really close together, but not very long, or, vice versa. So that was about 9 o'clock. I let my midwife know. About midnight, so from 9 to midnight, I just kind of labored, and this was early labor. I kind of leaned over on the floor. I was having back labor really bad, which meant that his head was just kind of tilted in a way it wasn't super ideal. So I was feeling everything in my back. It kind of felt like my pelvis would catch on fire for like 30 seconds and then kind of dwindle back down. I was listening to a birth playlist that I had prepared. Elisha was rubbing my back. I was kind of in this zone, just trying to be chill, trying to be calm, trying to, practice my breathing. It really wasn't painful at that point. At 12 o'clock it shifted and was painful, and they were coming, the surges were coming more frequently. So we called my midwife. Actually, Elisha called and said, okay, they're this far apart. And at that point, I think they were 5 minutes apart and lasting for like 45 seconds to a minute. She said, okay, meet me at the birth center in 45 minutes at like 1 o'clock. Well, I called her back about 10 minutes later, and I said, hey, I feel everything in my back. I'm not feeling my stomach tighten anymore. Do I need to be concerned about that? She goes, no, it's just back labor. Try to lean forward, try to get the pressure off of your back. And she said, I was very sad about this, but she said, you know what, based on the way you're talking, let's go ahead and have you labor at home a little bit longer. And I was like, no, I was ready to go to the birth center. So she said, call me back when your mood changes. And I was like, my mood changes? What is that supposed to mean? Well, it's real. There's a mood shift, and lots of people call it labor land. You go into labor land and your demeanor changes. You can't really talk anymore. Not out of pain. You can't really talk anymore, not out of pain, but just out of focus. You have to stay focused, and you can't talk through a contraction anymore. So I finally got to that point at like 3 o'clock. And So I called her back, and she said, okay, meet me at the birth center at 3:45. That next part right there, 3 to 3:45, was the hardest part of the early labor or active labor. It was, I even had the thought, what if I can't do this? And that was a thought that I had been afraid of since I had decided on natural birth, because I had told all of these people that I was gonna give birth in a tub and I was gonna be crunchy about it, and everybody said, you know, you don't get an extra medal for that, you know, epidurals are God's gift to women, you know, you should really do that. Are you sure you want to do that? Childbirth was the worst thing that ever happened to me. I don't know. And so I felt like there would be so much shame involved in giving up at this point, which for me, I think there would have been. That's not to say that there's shame in giving up at that point. I'm just saying how it was for me. But I had the thought, I'm afraid to go to the birth center, because what if I get there and she checks me and I'm only 4 centimeters dilated? It's already this hard. What if I can't do it? So I was doubting myself. So we make it to the birth center. The car ride was horrendous. It was horrible. I don't even remember a lot of it because it was just bad. I was still having back labor, so I wasn't able to lean forward in the car. So it was just terrible. It was about 18 minutes to get to the birth center, but it happened at 3 a.m., 3:30 a.m., so it happened in like 14 minutes instead. Elisha was able to drive a little bit faster. So we get to the birth center, and I am terrified that she's going to check me and I'm not going to be very far progressed. And I even told her that. I got in, and I was having a contraction right when I got in, so she put like this inflatable on the bed, and I was able to lean over it to get some of the pressure off my back, and she asked permission to check me, which is another little side note. Some doctors don't ask permission. My midwife always asked permission to do anything to my body, which I just very much appreciate, and that's a part of having a positive birth experience, was that I consented, right? So I said, yes, but I'm afraid. What if I'm not very far along? And she said, no, based on how you're talking, you know, based on how you're working through this, I think you're moving along. Your body's doing what it's supposed to do. And she was very reassuring the whole time. So she checks me, and I was 7 centimeters when I got to the birth center. And I was like,
wow.
A new wave of energy washed over me. And I was like, how could I have doubted my body like this? Mm-hmm. Look at all of the hard work that it's doing for me, and how dare I doubt it? My gosh. And so I just had this renewed energy. I was able to, I needed to go to the bathroom, and so I sat backwards on the toilet, which is a really great position. I didn't love it, but it's a great position to do some hard labor in. So sitting backwards, so your hands are kind of on the top of the toilet. So I was just there for a few contractions, and then I moved to the shower. So I was sitting on a birth ball in the shower. Elisha had the shower head kind of running water over my back, and I got into such a good headspace at this point that Elisha thought that I had stopped having contractions. They weren't any easier than they were. They weren't any lighter. They were more intense than they had ever been before, but I was able to handle them so well through breathing, and, you know, the water helps so much. And I was on a yoga ball, and so I was like rocking my hips, and just the movement and just rhythmic. He thought I had stopped having contractions. I hadn't. It was more intense than ever, but because the shower helped so much, I wanted to try the birth tub. So I don't even really remember the walk over to the birth tub, but it got, the water was ready, and I walked over there and I sank down in it, and I remember that feeling so good that your belly kind of has all this pressure lifted off of it. And I wasn't in the tub for very long when I felt kind of a shift happen, and I think it was his head coming through my cervix. But I had this thought again, like things started to get really intense, and I wasn't handling it quite as well as I was in the shower. And so my midwife walked in, and I said, I think I need to be checked. I need to know how far along I am. And she was just trying to be really encouraging. She said, you'll know your body's doing what it's supposed to. It's progressing. Just trust your body. You're doing good. And right at that moment, I felt something come out of me. And it, like, popped out of me. And I didn't even really push. It just, like, kind of shifted down. And something was sticking out of my body. And I said, I feel something. And I said it really frantically. And one of the assistants, one of the birth assistants, who's a trained nurse, not a midwife, but a nurse, she comes behind me and she goes, "Oh, that's your bag of waters." So I had partially birthed my water bag. And at that point, they were like, "Okay, this baby's coming." So they like kind of scrambled to get ready. And so spoiler, he was born at 5:54 a.m. and I got there at 3:45 a.m. So
wow.
I was only at the birth center for 2 hours. So they were shocked when my bag of waters was just right there hanging out. And that was the strangest feeling. I'll never forget it. It felt like a jellyfish was like in between my legs. It was so strange. But they got all their gear on and it was go time. And at that point, I kind of lost control a little bit. And I'm not ashamed to admit that. That was transition. So like right at that end, right before baby comes. And I started to say, no, I can't do this. I don't think I can do this. And I said it out loud. So there had been multiple times in my labor where I had doubted myself and then I was like renewed with energy when I realized that my body was doing what it was. And this was no different. This time it was so intense, I said it out loud, "I don't think I can do this." And Elisha said to me, "Yes, you can. You're already doing it." And my midwife said the same thing. And so I asked if I could push because I felt like I needed to push. My midwife said, "Wait for a contraction, but yes, you can push. He's right there. I can see his head." I pushed 3 times. Which was crazy to me. I probably should have taken a little bit more time to push, honestly. But I was ready for him to come out. I pushed 3 times. The first push, his head was out. The first time I pushed, his head was out.
Wow.
And then the second push kind of moved him further along a little bit. And then the third push, he was out. And I remember just saying, like, oh my gosh. I turned around and I grabbed my baby. And he was right there. There he was. And I was reminded again, your body knows how to do this. Why did you doubt your body? In that moment, it was like all of the emotions. It was relief and joy and amazement. And just like this incredible thing had just happened to me. And I had done it. I had freaking done it. That feeling was so worth it. Everyone doubted my body. I doubted my body, but I did it. And so they've done studies, and the childbirth is the largest oxytocin rush that you will ever have in your life.
Yeah.
It's more than any drug. It's more than the female orgasm, which is crazy. You have more oxytocin release and more endorphin release at childbirth than that. And it's real. Like you can't. It's like a women. And I didn't particularly feel this, but women have said like 10 minutes after birth, they're like, "Can I do that again?" Like that was the biggest rush of my entire life. I had 2 second-degree tears, and so my 10 minutes after was filled with stitches. So I didn't think that immediately, but I definitely thought it like 2 weeks later. I was like, when can I do that again? That was the biggest rush. I feel like a freaking superhero. What in the world? So it was incredible. And I held my baby, and then after they drained the water, I was able to stand up and walk to my bed. And I laid in bed, and my midwife gave me some sutures, and I just held my baby. I was completely cognizant. That's something that you don't always have with an epidural. You can't walk by yourself. You can't move around as freely, and I was able to do that, which I'm really thankful for. And I breastfed him, and we sat there as a new little family for like 3 hours. And then by 11 a.m., we were back at home in our own bed.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So
That's definitely not what you get in a hospital, that's for sure.
no, yeah.
There's no way to describe it, but what I can say is if there's any part of you, any part, even if that part is just 1%, that thinks, I wonder if I could do that, then you can. And you should. Because it's the most incredible thing. And the confidence that is born out of natural, unmedicated childbirth is all the confidence in the world that you will ever need to raise that baby. How could you get a bigger confidence boost? That completely prepares you for motherhood. And that's not to say that women who have epidurals or C-sections are less prepared for motherhood. It's not what I'm trying to say. Mm-hmm. But there's something different about it.
And just watching you go through the process of being pregnant, making the decision to do unmedicated birth and just a total natural birth, it was incredible to watch you go through that and to learn about it and be genuinely so passionate about wanting other people to know about what you were about to go through in the birth of Knox. And that's just, it's so cool to watch people go through that, but especially somebody who is so passionate about using their voice for the betterment of people around them. It was really, really encouraging and powerful to watch you go through things. Yeah. So what was it like holding Knox for the first time?
There aren't words. I don't think words exist to describe it. I wish I could give you more than that, but it was this human that I had grown. There's so much like pride, and no, pride is a bad thing. Pride in a good sense of look what God did. Look what my body did. Mm-hmm. And he was there. I had waited for him for 10 months. I had watched his little progression. I knew when he was the size of an orange seed. I knew when he was the size of a grape. I knew when he was the size of an apple. And now here he was, this full-grown, like, little bean. It was crazy.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
It really is. It's insane to think about. Like, you really did grow that child, and now he's out crawling around in the world, and he's just growing into who God's gonna make him and mold him to be as he continues to grow. So cool.
Yeah.
So cool.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Motherhood is hard. Childbirth is hard. I don't want to belittle that at all. It was freaking hard. I'm not telling you that if you go for an unmedicated birth that it'll be pain-free, that it'll be easy, but it is worth it. I promise it's worth it, and I promise you can do it. If no one else believes in you, I believe in you. I know that you can do it. Motherhood is just as hard, but you can do it. I believe in you. You can do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it so much. Is there anything else you wanted to kind of tell everybody about your birth, or anything else that you wanted to leave out there? Little nuggets of inspiration or anything?
I will say, so I mentioned that I did need stitches, that I had 2 second-degree tears. I was completely healed and felt totally normal about four weeks postpartum. So, and I really feel like if I had taken more time pushing, that my tissues would have been able to stretch a little bit better, and that I wouldn't have torn. Knox was only 6 pounds, 10 ounces. So I fully attribute my tearing to my eagerness and impatience. But yeah, that's where a doula can help. I didn't have a doula, but that is definitely where a doula can come in and help, and she knows where you're at and can see past it while you can only see right there. And so so yeah, so about 4 weeks is what it took to recover from that, and it really wasn't too bad. It was kind of bad while I was in it, but looking back on it, it was okay. But yeah, just if any part of you wants to do unmedicated, you can. Just the fact that a small part of you wants to, that is proof that you can do it. And what I would say is find every person available to you that will support you in doing that. Make sure your partner is supporting you. This is your body, and it is your birth, and it is your choice on how to birth. And yes, your partner needs to be supportive of that. And if they are just completely uncomfortable, I would say have some conversations about that. But ultimately, if this is something that you want, you need to put people in your life that support you. If people aren't being supportive, it's okay to say, you know, this really isn't helpful for me right now. This is what I want, and I need you to respect that. And so if you can't speak encouraging words, then we're going to have to refrain from talking about it. It's okay to say that. It's okay to say to somebody that you meet, that you tell that you're doing it natural, unmedicated, and they tell you this horror story about birth, or they start. It's okay to say, you know what, I'm just really not listening to negative birth stories right now. I'm so sorry. I would love to hear that story once I'm past this phase of my life, but I don't think I'm comfortable hearing it right now. It's okay to say that. Be careful if you're in a hospital, your OB can say that they are totally on board with you having a natural, unmedicated birth. But just know that there are lots of factors that go into having a hospital birth that are stacked against you. And it is very possible to have a natural unmedicated birth in a hospital. It's not easy. And I would say if you want an unmedicated birth in a hospital, you absolutely 100% need a doula there to advocate for you. But I would 100% look into a midwife and a birth center because they know physiological birth. And if you're low risk and if you're a good candidate for that, then that's where you need to be. That's my hard take on it. If you're low risk, you need to be with a midwife in a birth center, not the hospital. High risk, yes, you need to be in the hospital. But yeah, that's what I would say.
I love that. Yeah. And I appreciate you getting into how long it took you to recover from stitches and especially conversations with your partner. I mean, that's so important. Like you said, it is the woman's body. It is their choice on how to bring this baby into the world. And I think that's so encouraging just to hear that you have every right to bring the baby into the world the way that you want to, and that you can say, you know what, not listening to that type of stuff right now, respectfully, but
there's a way to say it for sure.
And thank you for all the encouragement that you gave to those moms, future moms, maybe currently pregnant women. Everything that you said is just so encouraging, and thank you for sharing your birth story. It's very, very encouraging and inspiring as somebody who's listening in on this and has watched you go through this. And even I'm sure people just listening who don't know you, who are listening to this, I'm sure there are so many people that are inspired, and I for sure am going to continue doing research on it, but you have definitely inspired me with your story to look into this. And there's the 1% of me personally that's looking into it. So I'm really excited about the future and what that holds.
Well, thank you so much for letting me share and step on my soapbox for a while. I'm very appreciative.
Anytime. I'm sure we'll have you back on the podcast to talk about more things. Definitely in the future, for sure. Cool. Well, thank you again for everybody who has been watching on YouTube and listening in. Very much appreciate you. This podcast couldn't happen without people like you who are listening in and want to talk about their passions. So thank you for listening in. Thank you for reaching out about your passions. Thank you to Kennan for being on this last week's episode and this week's episode. Very, very encouraging to hear her story. Hopefully you guys got some good nuggets of information and are really inspired as well. Go follow her on her Instagram. And it's the Canady woman, correct?
The Canady woman. And if you have any questions about natural, crunchy childbirth, hospitals, or even if you disagree with something that I said, I'm totally up for a conversation about it. I think knowledge is power, and so we should be having conversations about it. So feel free to reach out.
Absolutely. Yes. I will link her Instagram down in the description of everything. I will link everything that we've talked about in the description. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. Follow Passions Over Pancakes. Reach out if you have a passion that you want to talk about. And other than that, we will see you next week.
Bye.